13th of August, 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Sermon on Romans chapter 10 verses 1 to 13 and Genesis chapter 37 verses 1 to 11 and 12 to 28. Long before the Christian era, and long before even there was a nation of Israel, there lived a family in the Middle East, in Canaan. There was the father, Jacob, a grandson of Abraham, and there were his 12 sons. One of the sons, Joseph, is the focal character of a long story that dominates the final chapters of the book of Genesis. In fact, it takes up almost a quarter of that entire book. It's the well-known story of Joseph and his coat of many colours. From our reading today, we can see that Joseph was not exactly the sort of brother any of us would want to have. He told tales of his brothers to get them into trouble with their father. He boasted about the dreams he had, in which he seemed to be receiving honour from his family. Worst of all, Jacob showed that he loved Joseph more than his other sons, and he bestowed on Joseph a special coat, a coat of many colours. One translation, the King James, describes it in that way. Other translations refer to it as a decorated tunic, a richly ornamented robe, or a long robe with full sleeves. Whichever of those translations is correct, the coat does not sound like the sort of garment that would lend itself to serious farm labouring, and yet it appears that Joseph was allowed to go swanning round in it, being perfectly useless while his brothers toiled. And so, we are told, they hated him. This unpromising start to Joseph's story is not there for our entertainment. Joseph's unlikable qualities were actually the catalyst to the establishment of the nation of Israel. For, as we all know, Joseph's brothers' hatred reached such a pitch that they decided to kill him when the opportunity arose. But at the last minute, they sold him instead to some Midianite traders on their way to Egypt, and that got rid of him, they thought. Joseph became a slave in Egypt, but was eventually brought to the attention of Pharaoh, and was able to interpret his disturbing dreams regarding a severe famine that was to strike not only Egypt, but the surrounding areas, including Canaan, where Joseph's family still lived. By an amazing sequence of events, Joseph's brothers all turned up to buy corn from Egypt, and Joseph, who through adversity had learned to rely on the Lord and was now a thoroughly reformed character full of integrity, recognized and forgave his brothers, and was allowed to invite his entire family to Egypt in order to escape the ravages of the famine. Joseph thus saved his family, including his brother Judah, who'd been the ringleader in selling him into slavery. These were the people who became the huge workforce enslaved to a new Pharaoh that we meet in the book of Exodus. It was these people whom Moses was instructed by the Lord to bring out of slavery and to lead them back to their homeland in Canaan, the Promised Land, where they were forged into a nation, the nation of Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob thus became the founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, and Judah was the forefather of the kingly tribe into which Jesus Christ would one day be born. The nation of Israel, the Jews, were God's chosen people, shaped by his law, protected and nurtured by him, so that they remained a nation. They were not drawn into the surrounding pagan nations, many of which were huge and powerful. This in itself is remarkable. The nation of Israel has survived to this day, whereas the great world powers of Assyria, Babylon and Rome have vanished, as have many of the smaller nations, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, the Jebusites and all the rest, which are now just names in the Bible. Clearly, God's main purpose in calling the nation of Israel into a special relationship was ultimately to provide the Messiah, Jesus Christ, born in Israel, who would bring salvation to the whole world. When Jesus began his ministry, he confined it to the lost sheep of Israel. The Jews were to be the first people invited into the kingdom, and many did indeed respond to Jesus' message and become his followers. However, the nation as a whole, strongly influenced by their religious leaders, rejected their Messiah and had him crucified. A few decades later, God allowed the Roman army to come against Jerusalem and totally destroy it, dispersing the Jews across the globe, so that they never again had a temple, a priesthood, a system of sacrifices, or their own nation. It was not until 1948 that, following the terrible persecution of Jews under the Nazi regime, the State of Israel was created. That, however, was a political move, nothing to do with God's kingdom. But what is to be the fate of the Jews? In our passage from Paul's letter to the Roman Church, he is at the midpoint of a long argument in which he agonizes over this question. As a Jew himself, he claims to be in such anguish that he would almost wish himself cursed and excluded from God's kingdom, if only he could see his Jewish brothers saved. He'll reach a conclusion in chapter 11, but in our reading today, he is demonstrating that the Jewish law, a bone of contention in the Roman Church, which had both Jewish and Gentile Christians, the Jewish law had served its purpose. He acknowledges the zeal of the Jews in keeping their law, but accuses them of not basing their zeal on knowledge. For they have sought to establish their own righteousness through law-keeping, and their pride in doing so led them to reject their Messiah, with his offer of righteousness simply through faith alone. Paul contrasts the system under Moses with the freedom that Christ gives. According to Moses, well-being and life itself were the rewards dependent on keeping the law. But Paul states that the righteousness that is by faith is not difficult to reach. One doesn't have to climb up to heaven or descend into the deepest ocean to find it. It is nearby. All we have to do to obtain a right standing before God is to confess Jesus as our Lord and acknowledge in our hearts that he died and has overcome death for us. Paul emphasizes that there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles. They all have the same Lord and receive the same promises. God blesses all who call on his name. Salvation is easy for us. It doesn't require the keeping of multiple laws. But of course, it cost God everything. We were bought with a price. The law served its purpose in protecting the nation of Israel in order to bring our Messiah to birth. The nation of Israel was essential for our salvation. And so that story of a boy who really annoyed and frustrated his older brothers to the point almost of murder was a vital piece in the story of the coming of Jesus, the establishment of God's kingdom and of our Christian faith. How remarkable that God can turn such an unpromising beginning to such a triumph. God can bring good out of terrible circumstances. He can redeem the most hopeless situations. But think how much more God might achieve if we make ourselves ready and willing to serve. Paul ends this passage with a call to take the message of salvation to those who have not yet heard. Let us seek out opportunities to speak of the kingdom and demonstrate its values in our lives, so that more will come to know God and call on his name and be saved.